From strength to strength, you call me strength. To strength, you call me strength. To strength, you call me home. From strength to strength, you call me strength. To strength, you call me strength. To strength, you call me home. You call me home.
Open your Bibles with me to the Gospel according to Luke, and we are in chapter 23. It's the judgment of Jesus. And that's what we look at again here in Luke chapter 23, and it's the darkest day in human history. We're told that from noon until 3 o'clock, darkness fell over the whole of the land. And yet we call it Good Friday for good reasons. But you'd never understand, you'd never guess that at first. Here's Jesus being judged. 6 different settings. 3 courtrooms, so to speak. It's all illegal. I say courtrooms, but they were places where those in power would sit there and ask Jesus questions. They'd already made the judgments in their own heart, but there were 3 settings in the night. He went before a couple of high priests. He finally went through the whole Sanhedrin. So 3 ecclesiastical courts or religious courts, and then 3 civil courts. He went through the national one with Herod, the empire one with Pilate, and all of these different places, 6 different settings in which Jesus was judged here, and all of them were corrupt, and all of them were condemning, and all of them say something about all of us, because it's humanity. 6 is the number of man. No matter how many times you say it, 6, 6, 6, it's just man. And it's not that we're as bad as we can possibly be, but we've fallen short of what God has for us. You look at Jesus, you see the Son of Man, you see who we ought to be, who we can be. But when it comes to the 6 different settings in which Jesus was judged, they all agreed. We finally all agreed on something. They all found the Son of Man to be guilty. And that was their guilt. And that's our guilt. And I don't think if any of us would have been there, we would have done any better. So here today, God help us to look at it once again, like we prayed earlier, the eyes of my heart to be open. God help us to do better. Because you know, it is so easy to jump into judgment. It is so easy to do what they did. They all judged the Son of Man to be guilty. That's our guilt. And yet the last thing that Jesus said there before the religious court, before the Sanhedrin, he explained to them, this is at the end of chapter 22, they asked him questions. He said very little in all of these court settings. But there in verse 67 of chapter 22, he says, if I tell you, you won't believe, and if I ask a question, you won't answer. You're not open to me, you're not honest with yourself. But here's the word of hope, not a word of threat, but a word of hope. He says, from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So he says, you've all judged the Son of Man guilty, but the Father has not judged the Son of Man as guilty. In fact, the Father has judged fairly. We've judged falsely, but the Ancient of Days, it's a picture. I'm not going to take you back there again. But it's in Daniel chapter 7, and wow, every time I think of that picture, I can see why Jesus shines it forth. It's a picture of hope. Here's the Ancient of Days. Here's God the Father. And the Son of Man comes up to him, and all judgment is given over into his hands. And so we've judged him as unworthy. The Father has judged him truly. And he says, this one will be the judge of us all, the Son of Man. He's coming to judge the living and the dead. That gives me hope. Because you see him himself here on trial. You see someone who's abused in just about every way by us. And yet we won't get that far this week, but he says it later in Luke Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. There in Daniel 7, as we saw, Daniel has that vision, and we keep thinking that vision's all about the Antichrist and all the beasts in the world. And the beasts, they come and they go. And they have big mouths, and they get real loud, and they're very distracting, even as it was for Daniel in the night visions. But I like that phrase, again, that Daniel kept repeating. I kept looking in the night visions. I kept looking in the night. I kept looking in the night visions until finally I saw this vision, the Son of Man coming. And all judgment, all authority, all power, it's given to him. Man, that is hopeful. Now it says in chapter 23, verse 1, then the whole body of them, and I like the way that New American Standard has it, not just a crowd, but a body. The whole religious body of them got up and they brought Jesus before Pilate. And it's like the exact opposite of chapter 24, verse 1, where it speaks of Jesus, the body of Jesus rising up, and certainly not rising to condemn, but rising to heal. Here, this lifeless body, this religious body, gets up. They're all in agreement. They get up as one. The whole body of them, like some sort of zombie, they come and take Jesus and bring him to Pilate. To Pilate, the representative of the emperor. You know, talk about separation of church and state, of religion and political power. These people normally wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. But right now, we'll wield it together. Here's religion. This is the one religion God gave to Abraham, and through Moses it came down. And now the whole group of them come together and they condemn Jesus. And that whole body gets up and brings Jesus to the representative of Caesar. Here's this religion, divorced from love, now married to politics, married to power, because we got to get something done. And that's a lot of what it is involved in, this whole jumping to judgment sort of thing. As soon as the day was up, we got to get the deal done. You see, they're afraid. Remember, the whole reason they did it at that time during the feast is they were afraid of the people. They were afraid that, that huge crowd that the previous Sunday was saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. They were afraid that there was going to be a riot. They were afraid of what the Romans would do if there was a riot. They wanted to get this thing slammed out quick. That's why illegally they had all these judgments during the darkness in the night. And then as soon as it's day, they come and slam down the gavel and quick, get him over to Pilate as fast as we can. Just jumping to their own judgment in doing all of that. And it says that they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation. We found him forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. And we found him saying that he himself is Messiah. That means he's a king. Now all of this, you folks have read with me, and apart from me, you've read the story of Jesus. Is that Jesus? Jesus out trying to sway the nation in a political sense? Jesus out presenting himself as a king in an earthly sense? He had just said hours before, my kingdom is not of this world. Put away your sword, Peter. That's just not the way it is. Jesus forbidding people to pay taxes. Most of you know that story. That is so not Jesus. That is so, you got to be kidding me. But the facts don't matter. When you've already got a judgment in your heart, the facts don't matter. And there's no online Snopes or whatever to fact check on this whole deal. And you know what? It wouldn't have mattered. It doesn't matter. This is something they've jumped to judgment. Now they've got to bring it to the one who's got the power. It happens to be Rome at this point. And they just want to get this thing slammed out. And here they are. And how do you fight that? How do you fight insanity? How do you fight false judgment? How do you fight when all the words are stacked against you? You don't do it with words. You don't fight fire with fire. And certainly Jesus didn't fight words with words, because like we looked at last week, if you got a red letter Bible like mine, where the words of Jesus are in red, this is all dark. This is all black. Jesus says almost nothing during all these different places where he's put on trial. Pilate was amazed by that. And Herod was disappointed by it. And yet Isaiah explained it like a lamb to the slaughter. He doesn't open his mouth. And yet, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, he despised the shame. But here's this thing where, please understand, Jesus is fighting it. Just not the way you or I might. And he wins. He fights with his silence. He holds his peace because he has a peace that surpasses understanding. He has something that he says, I leave with you, I give it to you. It's an internal power. And he's not undone. Everyone else is all worked up, but Jesus, there's a peace inside of him. Can't see it, just know it, believe it. If you saw his face like Peter saw his face, you'd realize, man, his countenance just exudes something, confidence and courage. And so here he is, all this stuff being thrown at him. And I think it's really essential, so I'll point it out one more time, essential to see that here is the judge of all the earth being misjudged, being maligned, being railroaded, just steamrolled by the system, the legal systems of man, the church, the ecclesiastical courts, the civil courts, every kind of court we come up with. There's a picture of it in all of these court settings, and Jesus is being run over by all of it. So just understand this, the judge of all the earth knows how it feels to be misjudged, knows how it feels to be abused by the legal system, knows what it's like very up close and personally to be treated worse than trash by the people who are supposed to be protecting society and doing what's well for the community. So that's who is the judge, and I say yes. Who better to have the final say? Who better to make the last judgment than this man? And so here we see him, just all this crud, all this junk happening to him. And then there's something I'm just going to read to you, but there's a seminal scene, as you'd expect in the beginning, in the book of beginnings, in the book of Genesis. There's something that some of you will remember this story as I read it to you. But for right now, just listen, go back and read it later. But this happened a couple of weeks ago. You folks started flipping there, and I finished the whole thing, and some of you are flipping, and others came later and said, I didn't hear what you said because I was flipping, so just quit flipping, okay? This is something, but like all the things in the book of beginnings, it's more than just something that happened. It's something seminal. It's a seed. It's something that's very instructive, and it's there in Genesis. I'm not even going to tell you where until later, but you'll know the story. It's in Genesis, and here's Abraham. Abraham's with a couple of angels, at least, a couple of men. It looks like men, and there he is. And it says the men rose up from there and looked down upon Sodom. Yes, that's the one, Sodom. And Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I've chosen him in order that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. So the Lord, in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed, in his children, in his household. We often sing, Father Abraham had many sons. We do it with both arms, but my hand's holding something here. We claim a link, and we should. It's wonderful. He's the father of the faithful. But there at the very beginning, when a judgment was about to take place, and the Lord said, all the nations will be blessed in him, he said, shouldn't we talk to him so that he can bring about righteousness and justice, or so that he would keep righteousness and justice so that the Lord would bring upon him the blessing that was spoken. So in other words, the blessing isn't, you're all blessed, wave a wand, you're blessed. He says, the blessing will come upon him, his children, his household, and all the nations, that blessing. Are you blessed yet? The blessing will come when they learn to do righteousness and justice. If you don't learn to do righteousness and justice, no hand waving will work. He's saying, let's teach Abraham. Let Abraham learn about doing righteousness and doing justice. so that the blessing would be for him and for his kids and for his household and for all the nations of the earth. And so that's the idea. And then the Lord said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great. Their sin is exceedingly grave. There's something that's just crying out, not against them, it's from them. There's a pain, there's a hurt, there's something going on there that God is saying, I've got to do something. Because God's heart is moved by the outcry. Where there's sin, there's not an angry God. There's sin, there's a God who says, I want to deal with that. I want to cure, because that's the sickness. And so he speaks of this outcry, and he says, I'm going to go down and see if they've done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me. If not, I'll know. And you get the idea? It's a picture. Okay. I mean, God doesn't know. He's got to go down and say, I heard something. Let me see. It's a picture of a patient God, of a God who says, even though I know, I'm still going to take the time to research and investigate and look at. And why is God saying all this? Why am I saying it? Why are we reading it? Why is it here? You don't know. You just showed up. It's Super Bowl Sunday, and here I go. It's here because we need to become like our God. And even when we think we know, don't be so fast to say you know. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to check. I'm going to see. Abraham's going to have a lot of kids. They got to all learn to do this deal. And so God says, this is what I do. And the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Now, nothing has been said about that yet, but Abraham's assuming it, and he's saying, would you do that? He says, suppose there are 50 righteous there in the city. Will you indeed sweep it all away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are there? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? That's where it comes from. That shall not the judge of all the earth do? Come on. Now understand, Abraham isn't teaching God. God doesn't need any lessons. Learn that about prayer. He doesn't need any lessons. But we talk with God so that we can learn. And sometimes just listen to yourself. That's your prayer list? That's what you're asking God to do? And so he's talking to God, but God doesn't need help. But Abraham needs help. I need help. We all need help. He's talking to God, and he's saying, you wouldn't do that. Will not the judge of all the earth do justly? And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I'll spare the whole place on their account. Abraham said, well, behold, I've ventured to speak to the Lord, although I'm just dust and ashes. Suppose the 50 righteous are lacking 5. Would you destroy the whole city just because there's not 5? No. And the Lord said, I won't destroy it if I find 45 there. And then Abraham said, well, suppose 40 are found there. The Lord said, I'll not do it on account of the 40. He said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I'll speak. Suppose 30 are found there. And he said, I won't do it if I find 30 there. And then he said, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. And he said, I won't destroy it on account of the 20. And then Abraham's feeling like, man, am I pushing this? Because he keeps saying that, like, I'm really pushing it. I'm talking to God. You're already about to get torched. You're talking to God. This is dangerous stuff. He's feeling like he's toward the edge, and then finally he says, oh, may the Lord not be angry. That's the kind of God he is. He's always on edge. Oh, may you not be angry, and I'll speak just one more time. This is it. Don't get upset. One more time. He says, suppose only 10 are found. And the Lord said, I'll not destroy it on account of the 10. Now, who do you suppose Abraham is talking with all this time? The Lord. The very one that we're watching on trial. Jesus. He's talking to Jesus. Oh, don't get angry with me. What about? One more, 10. What about 10? And I could almost see the smile on Jesus' face, at least the way I know Jesus, at least the New Testament Jesus. No, I won't. And as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. That's where it ended. Because Abraham had no more imagination than that. He wasn't going to go for 5 or 2 or 1. He wasn't going to, and I'm not faulting him. Who could? I think Abraham was pretty courageous, given what he knew about God. But what we know about Jesus, the fact is that Abraham gave up. He quit. He said, oh, enough praying. Whew, that was dangerous. I got him down to 10. But you and I know he didn't talk Jesus down to 10. That's not the nature of Jesus. Yes, sin and pain and hurt and all these things cry out to God, and God's heart hears all of that. But what's his nature? We saw earlier in the Gospel of Luke 2 disciples talking to the angel of the Lord, talking to Jesus. And not like Abraham, 2 of his disciples, James and John, they were talking to Jesus not about how a community might be saved, about how many would it take to keep a community from getting torched. Those 2 disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, the love apostles, they said, Lord, how about us torching the whole community? Those Samaritans, they wouldn't receive you. How about, should we? Not can we, should we? Is that the way it works? How different they were even from Abraham. Abraham's saying, what would it take to save a community? And he's getting a lesson, and that's an Old Testament lesson. But his New Testament apostles are saying, should we torch the city? And you know what Jesus said. We've been going back to it over and over here in Luke. Jesus said, you're ignorant. You're ignorant of the kind of spirit that you belong to. The Son of Man didn't come to destroy lives. He came to save them. You missed the point. Even apostles, even disciples, we're all, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That's the idea. And so Abraham went as far as he went, and that was the end of that particular dialogue. But now that we know Jesus, how much more? Like we sang earlier, height, depth, length, breadth. What limit would you put on it? How much more? He's able to do exceeding abundantly beyond all that we would ask or think. So knowing that, it doesn't put a cap. It doesn't put a conclusion. It just gives you a direction. And it says that's who he is. And here he is on trial in Luke. The judge of all the earth is being judged by all the earth, saying he's not good enough. They're all saying he's guilty. And there's enough in this, the picture's really quite clear. There's enough guilt in it for every one of us. Every culture, every nation, tribe, people, tongue, religious, not religious, political, apolitical. Doesn't matter who you are. I think there's enough guilt for everybody in this judgment placed upon Jesus. And that's okay, because there's forgiveness for everybody. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. But that's the kind of judgment that's going on here. And all of these lies being thrown out. And you know, if you ever face even a little bit of this in any little court of your life, even if it's in your own home and with your spouse or wherever, understand the judge of all the earth knows what it's like. And look at how he behaved. Here's a real king in his court, even though he's the one on trial. He's the king in the court. He shows the courtly, the courteous behavior. He's the one who wins, though he shouts at no one. He wins. He holds his peace. He has a peace. Pilate asked him there in verse 2, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "It's as you say." You know, knowing that Pilate couldn't understand the kind of king, he says, "Yeah, you said it." And Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, "I find no guilt in this man." You know, Pilate was a pretty astute politician. He worked his way up through the ropes. He wasn't a just man. He was just a man. But he was a pretty astute person. He could look at Jesus. He knew these folks with all of their religious agendas. He knew a lot of them. He knew what they were about. They're saying, he says he's a king. He says that this and that about taxes, all this stuff that's supposed to get the power of Rome all worked up. And the representative of Rome is not the least bit worked up. He's able to take one look at Jesus and basically say, "Are you a king?" That's the tone of the language. It's like, you You don't look like an insurrectionist. You don't look like a rabble-rouser. You don't look like, where's... You know what? I don't even know how to talk to people anymore. It just occurred to me. Used to be when I was talking about a rabble-rouser, an insurrectionist, I say, where's the tattoos and the nail studs and the spiked up hair? Where you don't look like an inside. That's where I want to go. And now I use all that, and I'm talking about grandma. I'm talking about whatever culture it is. Jesus didn't look the part, and a guy like Pilate could take one look at him and go, "You're kidding me. They're saying all this about you. You're not that." And without even doing a huge trial, he wasn't about to jump to judgment. He actually had some pretty good judgment. I wish he'd had the courage and character to stick with his initial judgment. This isn't what they're saying. He's not that kind of person. I can see that. This is somebody who I find no guilt in the man. Pilate said there in verse 4 to the chief priests and the multitudes, "I find no guilt in this man." And there in that verse, you might not have noticed it. I didn't notice it till recently. But there's a new group. There's a new character just came onto the scene, at least as far as words go. It's given a name, the multitude. You might call it the mob. You might call it me and you. But there's this crowd, and it actually builds throughout the course of this story. There's this growing crowd that's here named for the first time, this multitude. But where it came from is like, whoa, it didn't drop out of the sky. It began in verse 1. It just wasn't named as a multitude, but it began there. Back in verse 1, it says the whole body, this whole religious body, and there were maybe 100 or so of these religious mucky-mucks who all got up, the whole body of them got up, and they brought him before Pilate. They didn't drive in a bunch of big Suburbans and SUVs and motorcade, although something similar in the time. When they walked from where they were to where they needed to be, they didn't have to go very far because all the places of power, just like today, they tend to all be in the same neighborhood. But when this whole body got up and walked down those crowded streets or those narrow streets over to the place where Pilate was, there was a crowd that saw this. This was like, whoa, these guys never get up as one group. Not this early in the morning. And it was a sight to behold. It was like, look at that, here they go. And people started following after, and they started to grow, collecting. Kind of like that spontaneous thing where Jesus, when he came in and Hosanna to the Son of David. But this was early in the morning, and it began with a core group. And I don't know any of their names, but you all know who it is. It's the same group that hangs around any place of power. Anytime there are courts, anytime there's places of power, there's always a group of people who are hangers-on, a host of hangers-on for various reasons. Some of them are power brokers, lobbyists, people who are pushing to get something done, pushing somebody's case, pushing something. And then there are other people who are in abject poverty, who are pleading desperately to get some justice for their own case, or maybe for their mother or father or someone else who's being railroaded or abused. You can see, go just drive down by the big water tower and go past all the court areas, and you see some people in suits and other people in rags and people who tend to, for whatever reason, be around the places, the courts and the places of power. So when the group of the religious got up and started moving toward Pilate, these people all got up and they started moving along that line. And it builds and builds. And I can see already, I'm not going to have time to talk about all this stuff. But you see this multitude gather. I will at least read to the last line, because the last line is so poignant. It's where Pilate finally gives up and gave him over to their will. That's us. And it starts with these people. Some of them are powerful, some of them are poor, but they're all looking to how can I move the gears of the system? How can I pull the levers? How can I get justice? Or how can I get a bribe to work? But that's the multitude. That's where it begins. That's the crowd. That's why later Jesus can talk about the women who are weeping as he's walking along. It's a different group. This isn't the same people. Some might be the same, but for the most part, this isn't the people. You couldn't get that many people into these courtrooms or into these alleyways or into this. We're not talking about tens of thousands. It's a crowd, and they're crowded in, but it's primarily people who hang around court and who are looking for justice and who are watching the movements of the power players. And so that's the multitude at any rate. When it says, for the rest of this whole thing, when it says multitude, think along that line. This is who starts getting moved and getting worked up. And finally saying, crucify him. That's what they said. Doesn't that break your heart? It should. Not just get him out of the way, not just crucify him. What are we? We're loved. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. But that's the multitude. There's blame for everybody in this story, and there's forgiveness for everybody in this story. How many have missed that? How many have found the blame and then cast the blame? God, history is full of that. Christians killing, doing atrocities in the name of Christ against the Christ killers. No wonder some folks, Jewish people particularly, when you talk about Jesus, they say just talk about something else. You talk about Christ and they can't hear a word you're saying. Not because of Jesus, but because of the way we are. And he loves us all. But that's the multitude, and that's the first time they're mentioned by name here in Luke's story. It says, Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, I find no guilt in this man. But it says, they kept on insisting. King James has a strange word. It says that they were more furious in their saying. They had a fury. It's a Greek word that talks about just where you're angry and you're saying the same thing and you're insisting, and that's what they were doing. They kept on insisting. Pilate says, I find no guilt in him. That's my conclusion. No guilt. How right Pilate was. No guilt in this man, more than he knew. No guilt at all. That's what Pilate said. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. They kept on insisting. Judgment was already done in their heart. Now they're insisting that Pilate carry out this justice. And they themselves knew it wasn't true. But, at a certain point when you keep on insisting, no, you don't know. Eventually you believe your own rhetoric. You believe your own story. It's just, again, that's human nature. And they kept on insisting. And oh, by the way, who is they? Because it's always so much fun to throw blame at them. They did it. They did it, Lord. Oh, Lord, forgive them. They did it. Again, they kept on insisting? Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitude. So it's not just the religious folks, it's the multitude. It's you and me. They kept on insisting. And yes, of course, these people were manipulated. They were not forced, but moved, manipulated. Matthew's gospel makes it really clear. The religious folks are working the crowd. And it's easy to work a group that's already looking for some sort of justice and looking for some sort of fairness, and now you've already got something to work with them. Or if they're corrupted people, if they're the power brokers, the people who are already they're already bribing, they're easy to bribe. They're easy to quid pro quo. I'll do this for you, you do it for that. Again, Matthew makes it clear the religious leaders are working the crowd, but that doesn't excuse the crowd. And some people are already close to the edge of saying, this Jesus he does not serve my agenda. Because a lot of these folks, their agenda, Barabbas will serve their agenda a whole lot more. Maybe they hoped 6 days earlier when he came in, Hosanna, son of David, here's the guy on the donkey who's going to kick out the Romans. But by now, no, Jesus won't suit. Barabbas might. And then finally crucify him. But here it is, they kept on insisting. And they're deciding that Jesus is not useful. And some of them are going to find that Jesus is actually offensive, because they fear that he is saying things that are going to, there are always some people who like the status quo. The way things are right now are pretty good. Or, well, not quite so good. The way things were 20, 30 years ago, those were the good old days. There are always people who say, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Why in the world can't we go back to the way it was, or at least keep it as good as it is? Those people are called conservatives by definition. And all of us are conservative on something, whether it's the environment or politics or music or whatever. We tend toward it. The people who are saying this, the people who are saying he's stirring something up, they by nature would have been the people who, we hate Rome, but better the devil you know. We'll deal with Rome, we'll deal with tax. What we don't want is we don't want a Barabbas. We don't want rabble-rousing. So this cry about, no, Pilate, do something, because this is coming to a head, do something. Some of them were sincere conservatives. Some of them were just hypocrites. But that's the cry here in verse 5. That's, it doesn't matter which group. Don't find the blame. Any of us can take where we're at and turn it to something where Jesus doesn't suit our agenda. And maybe he even offends our agenda. But that's this group, the group there that are saying, he's stirring up the people. We don't want things stirred up. He's teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. But when Pilate heard that, he asked, oh, so this guy's from Galilee. And when he learned that he was from Galilee, that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent Jesus over to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. In Jerusalem, everyone was there at that time. This was the Super Bowl. It was Super Bowl Friday or whatever, or Salad Bowl, in the sense that there's all these different groupings and people and flakes and fruits and nuts and leaves, and everyone's there. Everyone's in Jerusalem. Even Herod is there. Everyone happens to be there. Doesn't just happen. Again, that's part of it. Had to happen then. He had to be judged when everyone was there, so everyone can take part of the blame, so everyone can get the full forgiveness if they want it. But Herod happened to be there, and so, okay, great. I don't have to deal with this, because Pilate was not comfortable with it. He had enough, not enough character to set Jesus free, but enough to at least say, I'm not comfortable with this thing. Here's an out. And besides, it's actually, by giving it over to Herod, I'm going to look like I'm doing a favor to Herod. And it's always good politically to give somebody something. So this is like win-win, great opportunity. And he sends him to Herod. Now, verse 8 says, and here's where I'm going to have to just kind of read and move faster. We can come back later. But again, Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time because he'd been hearing about him, and he was hoping to see some sort of sign performed by him. And so he questioned Jesus at some length, but Jesus wouldn't answer him a word. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. Again, all of these words of vehemence, and you got to do something. And Herod's just like, I don't know, you won't do a miracle for me, you won't do anything, won't even talk to me. And so Herod's watching all of this, and so Herod makes his judgment. We'll talk about that later, but here's the picture of Herod's judgment. Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him as a nothing, that's what it means, they treated him like he was nothing. Then they made fun of him. That's what you do. If you're nothing, we'll just make fun of you. At least you're something now. And they dressed him in a gorgeous robe, a kind of a white shimmering sort of robe. Someone like Herod had a lot of these left over in his closet. Just grab one, throw it over Jesus, and sent him back to Pilate. That's Herod's judgment. Again, we'll talk about that later. But Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been at enmity with each other. The power of Jesus, even with enemies, to pull people together. And here's these two now coming together in this. And then finally, let me just read it to the end, and then I'll say something, and then I'll let you all go, as promised. But it says that Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people. There's those people again, you and me. And he said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges that you have made against him. So one look and he knew he wasn't guilty. Now he investigated and he's still not guilty. He says, no, nor has Herod. For Herod sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I'm therefore going to punish him and release him, which of course is not just, but again, he's not just. He's just a man and a politician. And so I'll do something. I'll just I'll beat him for you. But it does say that he was obliged, it was the custom, to release to them at the feast during the Passover, to release one political prisoner. And they all cried out together, saying, "Away with this man and release for us Barabbas," the rabble-rouser. He was the one who was thrown in prison for a certain insurrection made there in the city, and for murder, no doubt, killing someone as a patriot, or as a terrorist, depending on your political viewpoint. But he killed somebody because he had a political agenda, in this case for the Jews, and he's in prison for it. And so Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, he still wants to release Jesus because he doesn't want Barabbas back out on the streets, but Pilate, still trying, he went out again. And it says there, they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why, what evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. I'll therefore punish him and release him. If you want injustice, I'll do that much." But they were insistent now with loud voices, demanding that he be crucified. And their voices began to prevail. They were louder. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand should be granted. And he released the man that they were asking for, Barabbas, who'd been thrown in prison for insurrection and murder. And he delivered Jesus to their will. That's as far as I can go. To their will. To our will. God, deliver me from that will that can be so quick to judgment. That's their final judgment. Crucify him. That's our final judgment. I don't think I'm any better. But you know what the good news? That's not his final judgment. That's not God's final judgment. That's not the one who has the last say is the one who knows what it's like to be treated this way. And to say, "Father, forgive them." Just like my disciples, they're ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. In different ways, each of us have our ignorance. Jumping to judgment. You see it here. It's so fast, it moves so quickly, it's so final. Once it's done, how do you pull back he's going to be slam dunk crucified before you know it? Now what? No wonder later in the book of Pentecost they were pierced to the heart. What did we do? And so often when it comes to jumping to judgment, it's like, how did we get here? How did that happen? When did this? I've been thinking that a lot these last few years especially. How did we get here? What happened? Where did this begin? Right there in the center of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Do not judge lest you be judged. For in the way that you judge, you shall be judged, and by the standard with which you measure, you shall be measured." It's not that God will be corrupt if you're corrupt. God's God. He's still good. But whatever you throw on someone else unjustly, it hurts you more than anyone else. It messes with you and who you are. We need to be saved from our own judgments, saved from our own demanding our will. Jumping to judgment. You know, survival requires it. You could not survive if you just thought, is that a rattlesnake right there, or did I just kick a baby's rattle? I don't know. To survive, you have to sometimes shoot first, ask questions later. It's just the way it is with survival. But you know what survival is? Survival, by definition, is staying alive at all cost. It's not a Christian virtue. Survival is staying alive at all costs, whereas living is laying down your life for a friend. That's love. And frankly, I'd prefer to live than to survive, even if I have to die. I'd rather live and love than to just survive. Surviving has to jump to judgment. It has to survive. And I think that explains a lot in this picture. I think people were looking at their political survival, their job survival, their agenda survival, whatever it was that was more important to them when it came right down to it than Jesus. We got to get this thing going. I got to keep my thing going. And you jump to judgment. And here's the worst one we ever did. So again, God, if this happens in the darkest day, fine, but where in my life am I guilty? Because I'm not just here to survive, and I don't have to jump to judgment. To live, you have to love, you have to listen, you have to learn, and a lot of times you have to suspend judgment for the sake of justice. To say, you know what, I don't know yet. I don't understand. I don't see. The only perfect justice is with God, but we can approximate it. We can get a little bit closer. Like I said last week, I'm not against religion and I'm not against government. Just as long as the religion is true religion, like James defines it. As long as the government is a good government, like Jesus lives it. And no, it's never perfect, but we need to be approximating, getting closer to, looking at and saying, you know what, this is still not do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. We're not there yet. Let's work a little bit more on that. Because that's justice. And the blessing doesn't happen unless you learn to do it. Judgment is just a jump. Justice is a journey. One little step at a time. I think I'm a little closer now in the thing I just said or didn't say. I think I'm a little closer because I left a little more time. I allow a little more grace. It's not a comic book. It's not that easy to get all pumped up and chant a slogan and walk out because we got it. It's something you learn at the heart. You watch Jesus. You know that when you feel like you're alone in this world, when you feel like everything's stacked against you, he knows what that's like. Hold your peace. Keep your joy. Move forward. You'll win. You'll be victorious. Let's sing a couple of songs.
In my heart I hear this song of the highway, saying someday soon I'll stand above the clouds. I'll pass through this veil of tears. Your strength will hold me through the years. In barren lands I'll drink your springs of life that flow through everything. Strength behind me, strength before me, strength beneath me. If I stand or if I fall, strength behind me, strength before me, strength beneath me. If I stand or if I fall. From strength to strength you call me strength. To strength you call me strength. To strength you call me home. From strength to strength you call me strength. To strength you call me strength. To strength you call me home. You call me home. Strength behind me, strength before me, strength beneath me. If I stand or if I fall, strength behind me, strength before me, strength beneath me. If I stand or if I fall. To strength you call me strength. To strength you call me strength. To strength you call me home. From strength to strength you call me strength. To strength you call me strength. To strength you call me home. Step by step you call me home. Step by step. Step by step you call me home. You call me home. And in my heart I hear this song of the highway. Say someday soon I'll stand above the clouds. I'll pass through this vale of tears. Your strength will hold me through the years. Barren lands I'll drink your springs of life that flows through everything. Strength behind me, strength before me, strength beneath me. If I stand and if I fall, strength behind me, strength before me, your strength beneath me. If I stand or if I fall, strength to strength you call me strength, to strength you call me strength, to strength you call me home. Strength to strength you call me strength, to strength you call me strength, to strength you call me home. Step by step, step by step you call me home. Step, step, step by step you call me home. You call me home. In my heart I hear the song of the highway, saying someday soon I'll stand above the clouds.